The screech of tires cut through the midnight air like a blade tearing through silence. It wasn't the casual squeal of someone turning too fast into the North Point fuel station, but the desperate, violent sound of predators cornering their prey. 3 masked figures surrounded a sleek, black sedan, its engine still running, exhaust steaming in the cold October night. Inside the car, Evelyn Carrowan, the razor-sharp CEO of Titan Industries and one of the most powerful women in corporate America, found herself face to face with a nightmare she'd only seen in movies. But she wasn't alone in that parking lot. Behind the bulletproof glass of the station's night window stood Daryl Fenmark, a quiet single father working the graveyard shift, oil-stained uniform hanging loose on his tired frame. He wasn't supposed to get involved. Protocol said to hit the panic button and duck. But when those hijackers made their move, something older than fear kicked in. Something forged in places where hesitation meant death. In the next 12 minutes, this unassuming gas station attendant would do something that would leave hardened criminals unconscious, corporate executives speechless, and an entire city questioning everything they thought they knew about heroism. If stories of hidden strength, second chances, and the kind of courage that emerges from the most unexpected places move your heart, stay with us. This one might just shatter everything you believe about ordinary people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The night air at North Point fuel station carried the scent of diesel fumes and autumn rain, a combination that had become as familiar to Daryl Fenmark as his own breathing. He stood behind the reinforced glass of the overnight booth, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his weathered face, watching the empty highway stretch into darkness beyond the gas pumps. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, the kind of quiet shift where the biggest excitement usually came from a trucker needing directions or a college student counting change for energy drinks. Daryl preferred it this way. Quiet meant predictable, and predictable meant he could focus on the textbook open beside the cash register, studying for his automotive certification exam, while earning the overnight differential that helped keep food on the table and his apartment rent current. At 34, Daryl had learned to appreciate boring. His daughter Emma was asleep in their small apartment 12 miles away, safe under the watchful eye of Mrs. Patterson from next door, who never asked questions about his unusual work schedule or why a man with his obvious intelligence was working graveyard shifts at a gas station. Some people understood that life took unexpected turns, and sometimes those turns meant swallowing pride and doing whatever it took to provide stability for the people who mattered most. The black sedan appeared without warning, materializing from the darkness like a predator emerging from deep water. Its headlights swept across the empty lot as it pulled smoothly toward pump number 3, the engine purring with the expensive quietness that marked German engineering. Daryl glanced up from his textbook, noting the license plate automatically. Force of habit from years when attention to detail meant the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. The woman who stepped out of the driver's seat moved with the kind of confidence that came from boardrooms and corner offices. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting, her tailored black suit looked like it cost more than Daryl made in 2 months. She was tall, probably in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested she didn't have time for complicated morning routines. Everything about her spoke of power, success, and the kind of life where midnight stops at gas stations were probably rare occurrences. Evelyn Carrowan, though Daryl didn't know her name yet, had been driving for 6 hours straight, pushing through exhaustion and 3 cups of truck stop coffee to make it back to Millbrook City for an emergency board meeting scheduled for 7 a.m. As the CEO of Titan Industries, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates on the East Coast, she was accustomed to demanding schedules and impossible deadlines. What she wasn't accustomed to was the isolation of empty highways and deserted gas stations in the middle of the night. She'd chosen this route specifically to avoid the heavier traffic of the interstate, a decision that now seemed less wise as she stood alone under the harsh lights, credit card in hand, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the distant sound of trucks on a highway she couldn't see. That's when the first vehicle appeared, a battered pickup truck, primer gray and rust-spotted, emerged from the shadows near the station's edge where the security lights barely reached. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a shark testing the waters around potential prey. Daryl's attention sharpened instantly, his body responding to danger signals honed by years of training. He'd tried hard to forget. The pickup stopped at the far edge of the lot, engine idling, headlights pointing toward the gas pumps where Evelyn stood with her back to the approaching threat. She was focused on the fuel pump's digital display, unaware that she was being watched, evaluated, chosen. 2 more vehicles materialized from different directions, a pattern that made Daryl's blood turn cold. This wasn't random. This was coordination. This was hunting. A white van pulled up near the station's exit, effectively blocking the most direct escape route. A dark SUV positioned itself at the opposite end of the lot, completing a loose triangle that would make it nearly impossible for the sedan to maneuver out of the trap. All 3 vehicles sat with engines running, headlights dark, waiting. Daryl's hand moved instinctively toward the silent alarm button mounted beneath the counter, but he stopped himself. The alarm would summon police, but police were at least 15 minutes away on a good night. In 15 minutes, whatever was about to happen would be long over. He watched. Evelyn replaced the fuel nozzle and walked toward the station's convenience store entrance, still oblivious to the danger closing around her. She moved like someone accustomed to safety, to predictability, to a world where midnight gas stations were just minor inconveniences rather than potential battlegrounds. The doors of the 3 vehicles opened simultaneously. 6 figures emerged from the shadows, moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of careful planning and previous experience. They wore dark clothing and baseball caps pulled low, faces obscured, but body language unmistakable in its intent. This wasn't a robbery. This was an abduction. Daryl felt something cold and familiar settling in his chest, a combination of fear and clarity that he'd hoped never to experience again. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his cell phone, muscle memory warring with present reality. Part of him wanted to duck below the counter, hit the alarm, and let someone else deal with what was about to unfold. That was the safe choice. The smart choice. The choice that kept him alive to go home to Emma in the morning. But as he watched the figures converge on Evelyn Caraway, he saw something that made that choice impossible. She'd noticed them now, her confident stride faltering as survival instincts finally kicked in. She was reaching for her car door when the first man grabbed her arm, and Daryl heard her scream through the thick glass that separated them. It was a sound that cut through years of careful emotional distance, piercing defenses he'd built to keep the past buried. Suddenly he wasn't standing in a gas station in suburban Pennsylvania anymore. He was in a place where people screamed and others had the power to make those screams stop, where hesitation meant watching innocents die while safety glass and protocol and someone else's responsibility became excuses for cowardice. Daryl Fenmark had spent 8 years trying to forget what he was capable of when pushed beyond the point of acceptable losses. As he watched 3 men drag Evelyn Caraway toward the white van while she fought with the desperate strength of someone who understood that getting into that vehicle meant disappearing forever, he realized that some things couldn't be forgotten. They could only be buried until circumstances demanded their resurrection. 12 hours earlier, the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Millbrook City hummed with the controlled chaos that marked the end of another quarter for Titan Industries. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the urban sprawl below, where millions of people lived their lives unaware that decisions made in boardrooms like this one would ripple through their employment, their communities, and their futures for years to come. Evelyn Caraway stood at the head of a mahogany, conference table that cost more than most people's annual salaries, her fingers drumming against its polished surface as she reviewed quarterly projections that painted a picture of unprecedented growth and equally unprecedented challenges. At 43, she had built Titan Industries from a regional manufacturing firm into a multinational corporation through a combination of strategic brilliance, relentless work ethic, and an unwillingness to accept limitations that others considered immutable. The boardroom around her reflected the kind of power that came from making decisions that affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars with surgical precision. Awards lined the walls, recognition from industry organizations and government agencies that acknowledged her leadership in manufacturing innovation and economic development. But success at this level came with costs that weren't reflected in quarterly reports or shareholder presentations. 20-3 miles away, in the Oakwood Garden Apartments on the less affluent side of Millbrook City, Daryl Fenmark was helping his 7-year-old daughter, Emma, with her homework at a kitchen table that wobbled despite his repeated attempts to fix it. The apartment was clean but sparse, furnished with the kind of practical pieces that prioritized durability over aesthetics. Emma's drawings covered the refrigerator, bright crayon landscapes that depicted worlds where problems could be solved with imagination and where heroes always won. The contrast between these two worlds would have been obvious to any observer, but the distance between them was measured in more than geography or income. Evelis inhabited a realm of corporate jets and international conferences, where problems were solved through strategic acquisitions and market positioning. Daryl's world was smaller but no less complex, defined by shift schedules and homework assignments, by the constant calculation of whether Emma could afford new shoes this month, or whether the car would make it through another inspection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Neither of them would have predicted that their lives would intersect in a gas station parking lot in the middle of the night, or that when they did, the encounter would reveal truths about strength, purpose, and the hidden reserves of courage that ordinary people carry without realizing it. The emergency that had pulled Evelis away from her corner office and onto empty highways began with a phone call at 4:30 p.m. Kieran Dravith, Titan's chief financial officer and one of the few people whose judgment she trusted completely, had discovered irregularities in their European subsidiary that demanded immediate attention. Not the kind of irregularities that could be handled through conference calls and email chains, but the kind that required her physical presence and the authority that came with it. The Frankfurt office has been operating outside established parameters for at least 6 months, Kieran had explained, his usually steady voice tight with controlled urgency. We're looking at potential regulatory violations, possible criminal liability, and at minimum a complete restructuring of our European operations. The implications were staggering. Titan Industries employed over 40,000 people across 6 countries. Their manufacturing facilities produced everything from automotive components to medical devices, products that formed invisible links in supply chains that connected with people's daily lives in ways most consumers never considered. A scandal in Frankfurt wouldn't just affect shareholders and executives. It would ripple through communities where Titan facilities provided economic stability for entire regions. Evelis had built her career on the Wenbo principle that leadership meant being present when presence mattered most. While other CEOs might delegate crisis management to subordinates, she believed that the weight of decision-making couldn't be transferred to people who wouldn't bear the ultimate responsibility for consequences. It was this philosophy that had earned her the respect of employees and competitors alike, but it was also what put her on a highway at midnight, driving toward a board meeting that could determine the future of everything she'd spent 2 decades building. Meanwhile, Daryl was settling into what he expected would be another quiet night at North Point Fuel Station. The job wasn't glamorous, but it served purposes beyond the paycheck that appeared in his account every 2 weeks. The overnight shift meant he could be home when Emma got ready for school and be there when she returned in the afternoon. It meant avoiding the kinds of social interactions that might lead to questions about his background, about the gap in his employment, history that stretched from his 26th birthday until Emma was 3 years old. The station itself occupied a strategic location at the intersection of Highway 202 and the Millbrook Bypass, close enough to the city to attract commuter traffic, but far enough out to serve the truckers and travelers who preferred to avoid urban congestion. During daylight hours, it bustled with activity. Business people grabbed coffee and breakfast sandwiches. Construction workers filled thermoses and bought lottery tickets. Families on road trips stocked up on snacks and used the clean restrooms that Daryl kept meticulously maintained. But at night, especially on weeknights, the station became a different place entirely. The fluorescent lights that seemed warm and welcoming during the day cast harsh shadows across empty pavement. The sounds of traffic faded to an occasional whisper of tires on distant asphalt. The sense of isolation became palpable, a reminder that civilization's comforting presence was more fragile than most people realized. Daryl had chosen this isolation deliberately. After Emma was born and it became clear that he needed to reconstruct his life around new priorities, he'd sought employment that offered minimal complexity and maximum flexibility. The overnight shift at North Point provided both, along with something else he'd needed, the opportunity to disappear into routine, to become the kind of person who could blend into the background of other people's lives without attracting attention or raising questions. The owner, Malvin Carraith, had hired him based on a brief interview and references from his previous employer at a small auto repair shop. Malvin didn't probe into personal history or ask about the gap in Daryl's resume. He cared about reliability, honesty, and the ability to handle the responsibilities that came with being alone in a business that dealt with cash, fuel, and the unpredictable variety of people who stopped at gas stations in the middle of the night. For 3 years, this arrangement had worked perfectly. Emma was thriving in school, making friends, participating in activities that filled her life with the kind of normal childhood experiences that Daryl had sometimes wondered if he'd be able to provide. His own life had achieved a stability that felt like luxury after years of uncertainty. He was building toward goals that seemed achievable, completing his automotive certification, finding day shift work with better pay, maybe eventually saving enough to move to a house with a yard where Emma could have a dog. These were modest ambitions compared to corporate empire building, but they represented something equally valuable: the possibility of redemption, the chance to build a future that honored the sacrifices made to reach this point. Neither Evelyn nor Daryl could have anticipated that their carefully constructed worlds were about to collide in ways that would test everything they'd built and reveal capabilities they'd either forgotten or never knew they possessed. First thing people noticed about Daryl Fenmark was how easily they forgot him. At 5'9" with sandy brown hair that he cut himself to save money, wearing the standard issue uniform shirt of North Point Fuel Station over faded jeans that had been washed so many times the mighty original blue had become a soft gray, he moved through the world with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that being overlooked was often safer than being seen. His coworkers during shift changes knew him as reliable but quiet, the kind of man who always showed up on time, never called in sick, and kept the station running smoothly through long nights without complaint. To the regular customers who stopped by during his shifts, he was courteous but unremarkable, efficient at his job, but not someone who invited conversation beyond the necessities of transaction. What they didn't see was the way his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging details with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on noticing everything. They didn't notice how he positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines to all entrances, or how his hands remained steady even when dealing with difficult customers whose behavior would rattle most people. They certainly didn't suspect that the quiet man who asked if they wanted their receipt had once been entrusted with responsibilities that affected the safety of entire communities. Daryl preferred it this way. Anonymity was a luxury he'd earned through years of being anything but anonymous, and he protected it carefully. When Emma asked why he worked at night instead of during the day like other fathers, he explained it simply. Night work paid better, and it meant he could be available during her school day if she needed him. This was true as far as it went. What he didn't explain was that night work also meant fewer interactions with people who might ask questions about his background, fewer chances for casual conversations that might lead to revelations about capabilities he'd tried hard to leave buried. The apartment they shared in Oakwood Gardens reflected the same careful balance between function and invisibility. It was clean and well-maintained but not memorable, furnished with pieces chosen for durability rather than style. Emma's presence brightened the space with artwork and school projects, with the accumulated treasures of childhood that transformed any space into a home. But Daryl's personal belongings remained minimal, almost institutional in their simplicity. His bedroom contained little beyond a bed, a small dresser, and a desk where he studied for his automotive certification when Emma was asleep. Books on engine repair and diagnostic procedures shared, space with Emma's school newsletters and permission slips for field trips. The only decorative item was a framed photo of Emma on her first day of kindergarten, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while clutching a backpack nearly as big as she was. What the photo didn't show, and what Daryl never discussed with anyone, was that he'd spent the morning of that first day of school sitting in his car outside the elementary school, paralyzed by anxiety that had nothing to do with normal parental concerns. For someone whose professional life had involved protecting people from threats they never knew existed, the prospect of sending his daughter into the world without his direct oversight had felt like the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. But Emma had adapted to school with the resilience that children possess in abundance, making friends and embracing learning with enthusiasm that reminded Daryl why he'd made the choices that brought them to this point. Her teachers described her as bright and engaging, quick to help classmates and eager to participate in classroom activities. She spoke proudly of her father to anyone who would listen, describing him as the smartest and strongest person she knew, though she had only the vaguest understanding of why he sometimes seemed sad when he thought she wasn't watching. The sadness, when it came, was usually triggered by moments when the past intruded on the present, despite his efforts to keep them separate. A news report about international conflicts, a movie depicting scenarios that felt too familiar, the occasional nightmare that left him awake and watchful until dawn. These were the costs of carrying experiences that couldn't be shared with civilian counselors or discussed in normal social contexts, the price of having lived through situations that existed outside most people's understanding of possibility. Daryl had learned to manage these episodes through routine and focus. His textbooks on automotive repair served as more than career preparation. They were meditation objects, complex enough to require complete attention, but practical enough to feel useful. The precision required for diagnostic work appealed to the part of his mind that had been trained to solve problems through systematic analysis and careful attention to detail. His supervisors at North Point had noticed his aptitude for troubleshooting, the equipment failures that occasionally plagued the fuel pumps and card readers. What started as informal assistance during emergencies had evolved into unofficial responsibility for maintenance issues that arose during his shift. Malvin Caraith had mentioned the possibility of additional compensation for these duties, maybe even a transition to day shift work that would offer better opportunities for advancement. These were positive developments, signs that the life he was building with Emma was progressing toward greater stability and opportunity. But they also represented a form of exposure that made him nervous. Recognition meant visibility, and visibility meant the possibility that someone might begin asking questions about qualifications that seemed unusually sophisticated for a gas station attendant. The truth was that Daryl possessed skills that extended far beyond fuel pump maintenance and customer service. His understanding of mechanical systems had been forged in environments where equipment failure meant more than customer inconvenience. His ability to remain calm under pressure had been developed through experiences that would have broken many people. His instinctive assessment of threat levels and escape routes reflected training that civilian employers neither expected nor necessarily wanted in their staff. But these capabilities remained dormant by choice, buried beneath layers of deliberate normalcy that he'd constructed to protect both Emma and himself. He'd spent 3 years proving that he could be trusted with ordinary responsibilities, that the intensity that had once defined his professional identity could be channeled into the kind of steady reliability that made him valuable to employers and trustworthy to neighbors. What he hadn't anticipated was that some situations don't respect the boundaries that people draw around their lives. Some circumstances demand responses that can't be found in employee handbooks or parenting guides, that require accessing capabilities that might be deeply buried but never truly lost. As Daryl watched the 3 vehicles position themselves around Evelyn Carowin's sedan, he felt those buried capabilities stirring like muscles awakening from long disuse. The analytical part of his mind was already cataloging details: 6 attackers, coordinated positioning, professional-level planning that suggested experience and resources. The tactical part of his mind was calculating response options, assessing advantages and disadvantages, considering variables that most people wouldn't recognize as relevant. And the protective part of his mind, the part that had driven him to leave his previous life and build a new one centered around Emma's well-being, was recognizing that some battles choose the warrior rather than waiting for the warrior to choose them. The scream that cut through the night air hit Daryl like a physical blow, shattering the careful equilibrium he'd maintained for 3 years and triggering responses that he'd worked desperately to suppress. Through the reinforced glass of the station booth, he watched Evelyn Carowin struggle against 3 men whose movements spoke of professional experience and careful planning. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was execution of a plan that had been developed by people who understood how to make someone disappear. His hand moved toward the silent alarm button mounted beneath the cash register, muscle memory from countless safety training sessions overriding the deeper instincts that were beginning to stir. Protocol was clear. Activate emergency response, secure the facility, wait for law enforcement to handle the situation. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that kept minimum wage employees from becoming casualties in situations beyond their training or authority. But as his fingers touched the alarm button, Daryl's tactical mind was already calculating the mathematics of response time versus criminal efficiency. Millbrook County Sheriff's Department averaged 12 minutes to reach North Point on emergency calls, 15 minutes during overnight shifts when coverage was reduced. The nearest state police barracks was 18 minutes away under ideal conditions. Emergency medical services operated on similar timelines, assuming they were even needed after law enforcement secured the scene. 12 minutes was an eternity when measured against the speed of professional abduction. In 12 minutes, the white van could be 50 miles away on any of a dozen different routes that led to industrial districts where screams wouldn't be heard, or rural areas where evidence could be disposed of without witnesses. In 12 minutes, Evelyn Carowin would transition from victim to statistic, another unsolved case in a file that would gather dust while her family wondered what had happened and why. The attack was unfolding with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of rehearsal and experience. 2 men held Velas's arms while the third opened the van's sliding door, their movements economical and practiced. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no apparent concern about witnesses or security cameras. They'd chosen their target and their location with careful consideration of factors that would maximize their success and minimize their risks. What they hadn't factored into their planning was the presence of someone whose background had prepared him to recognize professional-level threats and respond with equal Professionalism. Daryl felt the familiar shift in perception that marked the transition from civilian mindset to something older and more dangerous. Time seemed to slow as his awareness expanded to encompass details that most people would miss. The way the attackers positioned themselves to block Evelus's view of potential help. The careful choreography that suggested they'd practice this exact scenario. The absence of visible weapons that indicated confidence in their ability to control the situation through physical force. Alone. His breathing deepened and steadied as training that had been dormant for years began to resurface. The shaking in his hands stopped. The anxiety that had been his constant companion since Emma was born was replaced by a cold clarity that felt both foreign and familiar, like putting on clothes that had been stored for so long that you'd forgotten how well they fit. Through the glass, he could see Evelus fighting with desperate strength, but her resistance was hampered by the kind of panic that affected people who had never faced genuine physical threat. Her movements were inefficient, driven by fear rather than strategy, burning energy that she couldn't afford to waste. She was struggling like someone drowning rather than someone fighting, and drowning people rarely save themselves without help. The leader of the group, distinguishable by the way the others deferred to his positioning, appeared to be issuing quiet instructions. His body language suggested irritation at Evelus's resistance, but not concern. This was a temporary problem that would be resolved through the application of additional force if necessary. In his experience, victims eventually stopped fighting when they realized that cooperation offered the only possibility of survival. What he didn't realize was that he was being watched by someone who understood exactly what kind of situation was developing and what the likely outcomes would be if it continued to unfold according to their plan. Daryl's mind was working through calculations that had nothing to do with fuel pump maintenance or customer service. 6 attackers, probably armed but weapons not immediately visible. 3 vehicles positioned to control escape routes, suggesting familiarity with tactical deployment. A target who was fighting, but not effectively, whose struggles were actually making the situation more dangerous for herself by escalating the attackers' timeline and potentially forcing them to use methods that would leave evidence. His own advantages were limited but real. The element of surprise, since they clearly hadn't identified him as a potential threat. Knowledge of the station's layout and the immediate surrounding area, including security features and potential defensive positions. Access to emergency communications that could bring help, though not quickly enough to affect the immediate situation. And buried beneath years of deliberate normalcy, capabilities that he'd hoped never to use again, but that remained as sharp as the day he'd first learned them. The decision crystallized in a moment that felt both instantaneous and eternal. Daryl could hit the alarm button, duck below the counter, and hope that Evelus Carowin would somehow survive the next 12 minutes. He could prioritize his own safety and Emma's future stability by avoiding involvement in a situation that wasn't his responsibility and wasn't within his authority to address. Or he could accept that some circumstances transcend job descriptions and personal safety, that there were moments when the only choice that mattered was the one between action and lifelong regret. Hand moved away from the alarm button toward the key ring attached to his belt. Among the keys that unlocked doors and secured equipment was one that accessed a storage room behind the station's main building, a room that contained cleaning supplies, maintenance equipment, and a few items that had nothing to do with gas station operations, but everything to do with the life he'd lived before Emma changed his priorities. As Daryl moved toward the booth's exit, his reflection in the security mirror showed a transformation that would have been invisible to most observers, but unmistakable to anyone who understood what they were looking at. The tired expression of a man working overnight shifts to support his daughter was being replaced by something altogether more dangerous. The careful posture of someone who had learned to avoid attention was shifting into the economical movement, patterns of someone who had been trained to eliminate, threats with maximum efficiency and minimum exposure. For 3 years, Daryl Fenmark had been a gas station attendant who happened to have an unusual background. As he stepped into the October night air, breathing deeply and feeling muscles respond to demands they hadn't faced since Emma was born, he was becoming something else entirely. The attackers dragging Evelyn toward the van had planned for many variables. They'd considered police response times, security camera angles, witness potential, and escape routes. They'd prepared for victim resistance, equipment failure, and the possibility of unexpected complications. What they hadn't planned for was the intervention of someone who had spent years learning how to make dangerous people disappear, and who was about to remember exactly how effective those lessons had been. The transformation began the moment Daryl's boots hit the asphalt outside the station booth. The October air carried the familiar sense of fuel vapors and autumn leaves, but now these ordinary smells mixed with something else, the metallic taste of adrenaline and the electric tension that preceded action. His movements lost the casual rhythm of a gas station attendant and acquired the purposeful economy of someone whose survival had once depended on eliminating threats before they could fully develop. The storage room behind the main building contained exactly what he remembered: cleaning supplies, maintenance equipment, and tucked behind a stack of oil absorbent, a duffel bag that hadn't been opened in 3 years. His hands worked without conscious direction, muscle memory guiding him through contents he'd hoped never to need again. The weight and balance of familiar tools settled into his palms like extensions of his own body, comfortable and terrible in their efficiency. Through the building's corner, he could see the abduction continuing according to the attacker's timeline. Evelyn was fighting with decreasing effectiveness as exhaustion and panic took their toll. The leader of the group was checking his watch, clearly operating according to a schedule that probably included contingency plans and predetermined decision points. Professional kidnapping was ultimately a business, and successful businesses maintained rigid adherence to tested procedures. What they couldn't have anticipated was intervention from someone whose own professional background had involved disrupting exactly these kinds of operations. Daryl circled wide around the building perimeter, using shadows and structural cover to approach from an angle that wouldn't trigger peripheral vision alerts. His breathing had settled into the controlled rhythm that maximized oxygen efficiency while minimizing noise. Every step was placed with deliberate care, avoiding debris and surface variations that might create sound. The part of his mind that calculated distances and timing was fully engaged, processing variables that civilian observers would never notice. The first attacker never saw him coming. The man positioned near the van's rear door was focused on his assigned responsibility, maintaining security while his colleagues handled victim control. His attention was directed toward potential threats from the highway and the station's front area, the logical directions from which interference might arrive. He wasn't scanning for approaches from the darkened area behind the service, bays where someone might emerge from shadows with capabilities that exceeded normal civilian limitations. Daryl's approach was textbook perfect, the kind of tactical movement that required hundreds of hours of training to execute correctly under stress. He covered the final 15 feet in near-perfect silence, timing his movement to coincide with the sound of struggling from near the van's front where Evelyn was still fighting against her captors. The noise provided auditory cover that masked any residual sound from his approach. The takedown was equally professional. A precisely applied blood choke that rendered the attacker unconscious in less than 4 seconds, with force directed in ways that avoided permanent injury while ensuring immediate incapacitation. The man simply folded into Daryl's arms like someone falling asleep, his body weight controlled and lowered silently to the asphalt. 1 down, 5 to go. The second attacker noticed his colleague's absence approximately 30 seconds later, turning to check on the rear security position and finding empty space where his partner should have been stationed. His reaction was exactly what Daryl had anticipated: confusion rather than alarm. followed by movement toward the last known position to investigate what appeared to be a tactical error rather than external threat. This attacker was eliminated with equal efficiency, but different technique. A precisely targeted strike to nerve clusters that induced immediate unconsciousness without visible injury. Daryl caught the falling body and arranged it behind a fuel pump where it wouldn't be immediately visible to the remaining attackers, but would be easily found by emergency responders. 2 down. 4 to go. The mathematics of the situation were shifting rapidly in favor of the defender. Professional kidnappers operated on the principle of overwhelming force and rapid execution. Their effectiveness depended on maintaining numerical superiority and psychological control over both victim and environment. As those advantages eroded, their operational confidence would begin to fragment, leading to decision-making errors that could be exploited by someone with appropriate training. The third attacker fell to a combination approach that Daryl executed with the kind of precision that spoke of constant practice and absolute confidence in technique. A diversionary sound drew attention in the wrong direction, creating an opening for approach and elimination that followed the same pattern as the previous 2 encounters. Unconsciousness, controlled descent, concealment of evidence. 3 down. 3 to go. By this point, the remaining attackers were beginning to recognize that their operation was experiencing unexpected complications. The leader's body language had shifted from confident control to alert concern, as he realized that half of his team had disappeared without explanation or communication. His tactical experience was sufficient to understand that such systematic elimination of personnel indicated the presence of hostile capability that exceeded random civilian interference. Evelis had stopped struggling, not from exhaustion but from the growing realization that something was happening beyond her understanding. The men holding her were displaying increasing tension, their attention divided between victim control and environmental assessment. Their whispered communications had acquired the urgent tone of people whose carefully planned operation was encountering variables that hadn't been accounted for in their preparation. The fourth attacker was eliminated while attempting to investigate his missing colleagues, following predictable patterns of movement that made interdiction relatively straightforward for someone who understood how professional teams operated under stress. His unconscious form joined the others in concealment positions that would allow easy location by responding officers while maintaining operational security during the remainder of the engagement. 4 down. 2 to go. At this point, the fundamental dynamic of the situation had reversed completely. Instead of 6 attackers controlling 1 victim, 2 increasingly panicked kidnappers found themselves isolated in an environment where their colleagues had systematically vanished and their operational superiority had evaporated. The leader's tactical experience was sufficient to recognize that they were now facing a threat that possessed capabilities equal to or exceeding their own, but his commitment to completing the mission was warring with the obvious wisdom of immediate tactical withdrawal. The fifth attacker made the mistake of attempting to secure a better defensive position while maintaining control of Evelis, a tactical movement that created the opening Daryl had been waiting for. The man's attention was focused on potential threat directions when the actual threat materialized from an angle that his positioning couldn't accommodate, resulting in incapacitation that followed the same efficient pattern as his colleagues. 5 down, 1 to go. The final confrontation occurred in full view of Evelis, who watched with a combination of terror and fascination as Daryl emerged from the shadows like something from a nightmare that was somehow working in her favor. The remaining attacker, faced with the systematic elimination of his entire team by an opponent he had never seen clearly, made the decision to prioritize his own survival over mission completion. His attempt to escape was interrupted by capabilities that exceeded his own training and experience. The engagement was brief, decisive, and concluded with the same controlled application of force that had characterized the entire operation. No permanent injury, no excessive violence. Just the precise application of technique that achieved the necessary result with minimum risk to all parties. 6 down, 0 to go. In less than 8 minutes, Daryl Fenmark had transformed a professional kidnapping operation into a scene that would puzzle law enforcement investigators for months. 6 unconscious attackers arranged in positions where they could be easily located and apprehended. 3 vehicles that would provide extensive evidence about planning and preparation. One very shaken CEO who was alive and unharmed, but struggling to process what she had just witnessed, and standing in the middle of the gas station parking lot, breathing steadily and checking Evelise for injuries with the efficient concern of someone accustomed to post-operation assessment. A man who had just demonstrated capabilities that existed far outside the normal parameters of civilian life. The most disturbing aspect of the entire engagement, from the perspective of anyone who understood what they were observing, wasn't the violence or the efficiency, or even the systematic nature of the intervention. It was how completely normal Daryl appeared as he helped Evelise to her feet and asked if she needed medical attention. As if eliminating 6 professional kidnappers was just another aspect of customer service at North Point Fuel Station. The transformation back to gas station attendant was already beginning, but for anyone who had witnessed what just occurred, the question would linger. What kind of man possessed these capabilities? And what circumstances had brought him to work the night shift at a gas station in suburban Pennsylvania? Those answers would prove even more disturbing than the demonstration itself. The silence that followed the systematic elimination of 6 professional kidnappers was more unsettling than the violence that had preceded it. Evelise Carowin stood in the harsh fluorescent glow of the gas station parking lot, her designer suit torn at the shoulder, her carefully maintained composure shattered by the realization that she had just witnessed capabilities that existed outside her understanding of civilian life. The unconscious attackers lay arranged around the lot like discarded mannequins, their positioning so methodical that it spoke of someone who had performed similar operations many times before. Daryl moved through the aftermath with the same quiet efficiency he'd displayed during the engagement itself. His hands were steady as he checked each attacker for injuries, ensuring that his precisely applied force had achieved incapacitation without permanent damage. His breathing remained controlled, his movements economical, as if eliminating armed kidnappers was just another aspect of customer service that required attention to detail and professional follow-through. "Are you injured?" His voice carried the same conversational tone he used when asking customers if they needed their receipt, but Evelise could hear something underneath it now, a quality that suggested depths she hadn't recognized during their brief interaction at the fuel pump. She shook her head, then found her voice. "Who are you?" It was the question that Daryl had spent 3 years hoping he would never hear. The inquiry that could unravel the carefully constructed normalcy he'd built around Emma's childhood. He looked at Evelise for a long moment, evaluating risks and calculating consequences with the same analytical precision he'd applied to tactical problems. "Someone who works the night shift at a gas station," he said finally. Someone who saw a woman in trouble and decided to help. But even as he spoke, Daryl knew that explanation wouldn't satisfy someone with Evelise's intelligence and experience. Corporate executives didn't reach her level without developing sophisticated abilities to assess people and situations, to recognize when surface explanations concealed deeper truths. The demonstration she'd just witnessed had revealed capabilities that couldn't be explained by employee training manuals or civilian self-defense classes. Sound of approaching sirens provided temporary reprieve from questions that Daryl wasn't prepared to answer. He'd activated the station's alarm system after neutralizing the final attacker, and emergency responders were arriving with the efficiency that marked well-coordinated municipal services. The first sheriff's deputy on scene took in the situation with the kind of professional assessment that suggested experience with unusual circumstances. But even his training hadn't prepared him for the methodical arrangement of unconscious suspects and the obvious sophistication of the intervention that had created it. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Deputy Alvin Cresvale was addressing Evelys, but his eyes kept shifting toward Daryl with the wariness that law enforcement officers developed when encountering situations that didn't fit standard templates. "I'm fine," Evelys managed. "This man saved my life." More emergency vehicles arrived in rapid succession. Additional sheriff's units, state police investigators, paramedics to assess the unconscious attackers, crime scene technicians to document evidence that would provide law enforcement with months of investigative material. The parking lot transformed into a complex choreography of official activity, with Daryl and Evelys separated for individual interviews that would establish the basic facts of what had occurred. Daryl's statement to investigators was carefully constructed to provide accurate information while avoiding details that might prompt deeper inquiry into his background or capabilities. He described hearing Evelys's scream, recognizing that she was in danger, and intervening to help. When asked about his methods for subduing 6 attackers, he explained that he'd had some martial arts training and had been fortunate to catch them off guard. The investigators accepted this explanation because it was technically accurate and because the alternative implications were too complex for a preliminary report. Professional kidnapping rings were sophisticated criminal enterprises that required extensive resources to investigate and prosecute. The immediate priority was securing evidence, treating injuries, and ensuring that all parties involved were safe and accounted for. Even as the official machinery of law enforcement processed the scene according to established protocols, Evelys was conducting her own investigation with resources that exceeded those available to local police departments. While giving her statement to investigators, she was also using her smartphone to initiate background research that would provide answers to questions that went beyond the scope of criminal proceedings. Titan Industries employed security consultants who specialized in executive protection and threat assessment. Within an hour of the attack, Evelys had activated those resources with specific instructions to investigate Daryl Fenmark, employee of North Point Fuel Station, resident of Oakwood Garden Apartments, father of 1 daughter, and possessor of capabilities that suggested background in specialized military or intelligence operations. The preliminary results arrived while she was still providing her statement to investigators. Daryl Fenmark had no criminal record, no history of violence or erratic behavior, and employment references that describe him as reliable and unremarkable. But there was a gap in his documented history that extended from his 26th to his 29th birthday, a period during which he appeared to have simply disappeared from all normal civilian records. More detailed investigation revealed fragments of information that painted a picture without providing complete clarity. Military service records that were partially classified, training certifications in specialties that were typically associated with special operations units, references to deployments in locations that were consistent with counter-terrorism operations during the height of international conflicts that had dominated headlines a decade earlier. Man who had saved her life with such methodical efficiency wasn't just a gas station attendant who had gotten lucky. He was someone who had been trained to eliminate precisely the kinds of threats that had materialized in the parking lot of North Point Fuel Station. Someone whose current employment represented a dramatic step down from capabilities that were typically associated with the most elite levels of military service. By the time law enforcement had completed their initial processing of the scene, Evelys possessed enough information to understand that Daryl Fenmark was either the most qualified gas station attendant in Pennsylvania, or someone who had deliberately chosen to disappear into ordinary civilian life for reasons that merited further investigation. Attackers themselves provided additional pieces to the puzzle that was emerging from the evening's events. All 6 men carried identification that appeared authentic, but would later prove to be sophisticated forgeries. Their vehicles contained equipment that suggested professional-level surveillance and planning capabilities. Most disturbing, their apparent target selection indicated access to information about Evelus's travel plans and schedule that should have been limited to a very small circle of trusted associates. This wasn't random criminal opportunism. Someone with significant resources had planned and executed an operation designed to kidnap one of the most prominent business leaders on the East Coast. The fact that the operation had been thwarted by the intervention of a night shift gas station attendant would have been remarkable under any circumstances. The discovery that the attendant possessed capabilities typically associated with special operations forces elevated the situation into territory that required careful consideration of implications that extended far beyond local criminal proceedings. As dawn began to lighten the sky above North Point Fuel Station, Darrell found himself facing the kind of exposure he had spent 3 years avoiding. Media attention, law enforcement scrutiny, and most problematically, questions from someone with the resources and motivation to discover answers that could complicate the life he'd built with Emma. But he also found himself facing something he hadn't expected: genuine gratitude from someone who understood exactly what had been at stake and who possessed the intelligence to recognize that his intervention had required capabilities that couldn't be dismissed as luck or coincidence. "I owe you my life," Evelus said when investigators finally allowed them to speak privately. "And I think I owe you something else as well." "You don't owe me anything," Darrell replied. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," she said firmly. "You did what someone with very specific training and experience would have done." Someone who had been prepared for exactly that kind of situation. They looked at each other across the space between their worlds, the corporate executive and the gas station attendant, both understanding that the events of the night had created a connection that transcended their apparent circumstances. For the first time in years, Darrell was face to face with someone who might understand the weight of carrying capabilities that couldn't be easily explained or casually dismissed. "I have a daughter," he said finally. "She's 7. Everything I do is about making sure her life is as normal as possible." Evelus nodded slowly. "I understand that. But I also understand that some capabilities are too valuable to waste on overnight shifts at gas stations." It was an offer and a recognition rolled into a single statement, an acknowledgement that the demonstration she'd witnessed represented resources that could be applied to purposes beyond fuel pump maintenance and customer service. But it was also a recognition that those resources came attached to someone who had chosen his current circumstances for reasons that deserved respect and consideration. The conversation that followed would establish the foundation for a relationship that would transform both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. But it began with mutual recognition of truths that couldn't be spoken aloud in parking lots, surrounded by law enforcement personnel and media representatives who were beginning to arrive as news of the incident spread through communication networks. Darrell Fenmark wasn't just someone who worked the night shift at a gas station, and Evelus Carowin was beginning to understand that her rescue had been accomplished by someone whose story was far more complex than his current circumstances suggested. The question that remained was whether those stories could be reconciled with the realities of their respective responsibilities, and whether the connection forged by violence could evolve into something that honored both the protection of Emma's childhood and the recognition of capabilities that deserved purposes worthy of their sophistication. 3 days after the incident at North Point Fuel Station, Evelus Carowin sat in her corner office 42 floors above downtown Millbrook City, staring at a security report that had fundamentally altered her understanding of both the threats she faced and the resources available to address them. The investigation into her attempted kidnapping had revealed a web of corporate espionage and international competition that extended far beyond the initial criminal charges filed against her attackers. Someone with significant resources and sophisticated intelligence capabilities had been tracking her movements, analyzing her schedule, and planning operations that suggested access to information that should have been limited to her most trusted associates. The attack at the gas station hadn't been opportunistic crime, but rather the execution of a plan that had been months in development, involving surveillance and preparation that indicated professional-level organization and funding. More disturbing still were the implications of what had been prevented. Forensic analysis of equipment found in the attackers' vehicles suggested that her kidnapping would have been followed by demands that went beyond simple ransom. Corporate secrets, strategic information, and access to Titan Industries' proprietary technologies appeared to have been the ultimate objectives of an operation that used her personal safety as leverage to achieve industrial espionage on an unprecedented scale. The realization that she had been targeted not just as an individual but as a gateway to corporate assets that could affect thousands of employees and millions of shareholders had transformed her perspective on both personal security and corporate responsibility. The comfortable assumption that success and prominence carried manageable risks had been shattered by evidence that sophisticated adversaries were willing to employ methods that civilian law enforcement was ill-equipped to prevent or counter. But the most remarkable aspect of the entire situation was the intervention of someone who had been perfectly positioned to recognize and neutralize threats that exceeded normal civilian capabilities. Daryl Fenmark's background check had revealed fragments of a story that suggested training and experience in exactly the kinds of operations that her attackers had been executing, capabilities that had been dormant, but not forgotten when circumstances demanded their application. The preliminary security assessment had raised questions about whether his presence at the gas station during her attack had been coincidental or whether some form of protective surveillance had been in place without her knowledge. But deeper investigation had confirmed that his employment at Northpoint was genuine. His financial circumstances were consistent with single-parent responsibilities, and his daughter's school records indicated a life built around providing stability and normalcy for a 7-year-old whose own background contained no unusual elements. Daryl Fenmark was exactly what he appeared to be, a former special operations soldier who had chosen to disappear into civilian life in order to provide his daughter with the kind of childhood that his own professional history had made him uniquely qualified to protect. The intersection of his capabilities with her crisis had been genuine coincidence, but the results suggested possibilities that extended far beyond chance encounters at gas stations, which was why Evelis was reviewing employment contracts rather than focusing on the quarterly projections that normally demanded her attention during morning meetings. Titan Industries required security capabilities that exceeded the services provided by traditional corporate protection firms. The threats that had materialized around her kidnapping suggested adversaries with resources and sophistication that demanded equally sophisticated responses. But more importantly, she had recognized in Daryl something that her years of executive experience had taught her to value above all other qualities: the combination of exceptional capability with genuine integrity, skills that could be trusted completely because they were guided by principles that couldn't be compromised by external pressures or financial incentives. The offer she was preparing represented more than employment opportunity. It was recognition that some capabilities deserved purposes worthy of their sophistication, and that the protection of people and principles sometimes required resources that couldn't be found through normal hiring processes. Meanwhile, 12 miles away in the Oakwood Garden Apartments, Daryl was helping Emma with her morning routine while wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The media attention surrounding the gas station incident had been managed carefully by law enforcement and corporate public relations specialists, But Emma was old enough to understand that something significant had happened involving her father's work. "Daddy, why were there so many police cars at your job?" She had asked the morning after the incident, her 7-year-old logic seeking explanations that made sense within her limited understanding of adult complications. Someone was in trouble, and the police came to help, Daryl had explained, which was accurate without being complete. Sometimes grown-ups need help from other grown-ups, and that's what happened. But Emma's questions reflected deeper concerns that couldn't be addressed with simple explanations. She had inherited her father's observational skills along with his stubborn persistence, and she was beginning to recognize that the careful normalcy of their life together concealed complexities that she didn't yet understand but that affected their daily routines in ways that extended beyond his work schedule. The phone call from Evelyn came while Emma was at school, during the quiet hours when Daryl normally studied for his automotive certification or caught up on sleep between shifts. Her voice carried the professional confidence he remembered from their brief interaction before the attack, but underneath it he could hear something else, the recognition that their circumstances had created connections that transcended normal social boundaries. "I'd like to meet with you," she said without preamble. "There are things we need to discuss that can't be addressed over the phone." The meeting took place at a small cafe in downtown Millbrook City, neutral territory that allowed for private conversation, without the formality of corporate offices or the complications of personal spaces. Evelyn arrived dressed in civilian clothes that suggested wealth without ostentation, her manner less polished than during their previous encounters, but more genuine in ways that indicated she was speaking for herself rather than as a corporate representative. "Investigation into the attack has revealed some disturbing information," she began, sliding a folder across the table that contained security assessments and threat analyses that painted a picture of sophisticated adversaries with resources that exceeded normal criminal organizations. Daryl reviewed the documents with the analytical attention that such materials demanded, his expression remaining neutral despite the implications that were emerging from forensic evidence and intelligence reports. Corporate espionage had evolved into industrial warfare conducted by organizations with capabilities that rivaled government agencies, and Evelyn had been targeted, not as an individual but as a strategic asset whose capture could provide access to technologies and information that carried national security implications. "This kind of threat requires responses that go beyond traditional corporate security," she continued. "I need people who understand how sophisticated adversaries operate, who can recognize threats before they fully develop, and who can respond with capabilities that match what we're facing." It was an offer that recognized his background without requiring him to discuss details that remained classified. Acknowledgement that his current circumstances represented a resource allocation that didn't match the sophistication of the capabilities involved. But it was also an opportunity that carried risks to the life he had built with Emma, exposure to professional responsibilities that could compromise the stability he had worked to provide for his daughter. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, though part of him already understood the implications of her approach. "Director of Corporate Security for Titan Industries," she replied. "Salary that reflects the importance of the position, benefits that include comprehensive health and education coverage, and responsibilities that would utilize your background in ways that serve legitimate purposes." The offer represented more than financial improvement or professional recognition. It was validation that his capabilities could be applied to protection rather than elimination, to purposes that aligned with the principles that had guided his decision to leave military service and focus on Emma's upbringing. It also represented exposure to responsibilities that could affect thousands of people and situations that might require capabilities he had hoped never to use again. The comfortable anonymity of night shifts in automotive textbooks would be replaced by visibility and accountability that carried personal and professional risks he had spent years avoiding. "I have a daughter," he said, The same explanation he had offered during their previous conversation, but carrying additional weight now that the implications of her offer were clear. "I understand that," Evelyn replied. "In fact, that's one of the reasons I trust your judgment. Someone who has made the choices you've made for the reasons you've made them is exactly the kind of person who can be trusted with responsibilities that affect other people's safety." The conversation that followed explored possibilities that neither had anticipated when they first encountered each other across a fuel pump 3 days earlier. Professional partnership based on mutual respect and complementary capabilities, recognition that some threats required responses that went beyond normal business practices, and the understanding that protecting what mattered most sometimes required engaging with dangers that couldn't be avoided through careful distance or deliberate anonymity. The decision that emerged from their discussion would transform both their lives in ways that honored their respective responsibilities while acknowledging that some capabilities were too valuable to waste on circumstances that didn't challenge their full potential. But first, Daryl needed to have a conversation with Emma about changes that would affect their life together, and about the possibility that her father's background might serve purposes that were worthy of the sacrifices they had both made to reach this point. The mentorship that was beginning to develop between Evelyn and Daryl would extend beyond professional collaboration into recognition that some partnerships were built on foundations that transcended normal employment relationships, connections forged by circumstances that revealed character under pressure and capabilities that deserved purposes worthy of their sophistication. 6 months after Daryl Fenmark transitioned from night shift gas station attendant to director of corporate security for Titan Industries, the threats that had initially justified his hiring evolved into something far more dangerous and immediate than even Evelyn's most pessimistic security assessments had anticipated. The industrial espionage that had targeted her kidnapping had been merely the opening gambit in a campaign of corporate warfare that now threatened not just Titan Industries but the economic stability of entire regions that depended on the company's manufacturing operations. Crisis began with what appeared to be routine equipment failures at Titan's largest manufacturing facility in Thornfield, Pennsylvania, a massive complex that employed over 8,000 people and produced automotive components for major manufacturers throughout North America. Initial investigations attributed the failures to normal wear and maintenance issues, but Daryl's analysis of the incident patterns revealed signatures that suggested systematic sabotage designed to create catastrophic failures during peak production periods. The implications were staggering. Thornfield manufacturing wasn't just an industrial facility, but the economic heart of a community where 3 generations of families had built their lives around steady employment and predictable futures. Sabotage that forced plant closure would devastate not just the employees directly affected, but the network of suppliers, service providers, and local businesses that formed the ecosystem surrounding major manufacturing operations. But more immediately dangerous were the potential safety implications of sabotage designed to create equipment failures during active production. Manufacturing processes that involved molten metal, high-pressure systems, and automated machinery capable of producing thousands of components per hour could become death traps if safety systems were compromised by people who understood exactly how to create maximum casualties while maintaining plausible deniability. The investigation that Daryl conducted revealed a level of planning and preparation that exceeded anything he had encountered during his military service. The saboteurs possessed detailed knowledge of Titan's manufacturing processes, access to technical specifications that should have been limited to senior engineering personnel, and capabilities that suggested training in industrial terrorism rather than simple corporate espionage. Most disturbing was the discovery that the sabotage was being coordinated with labor disputes and regulatory challenges that would maximize the economic impact of plant closure while minimizing the apparent connection between different pressure points. Someone with sophisticated understanding of both industrial operations and economic warfare was orchestrating a campaign designed to force Titan Industries into bankruptcy or acquisition by foreign competitors who had been positioning themselves to acquire American manufacturing capabilities at discount prices. The immediate threat was a planned escalation that would create a catastrophic failure during the next shift change, when over 2,000 employees would be transitioning through areas where compromised safety systems could create casualties that would be blamed on corporate negligence rather than deliberate sabotage. The timing was calculated to maximize both human impact and media attention while creating legal liability that would destroy Titan's reputation and financial stability. Daryl's assessment of the situation confirmed what he had hoped never to face again: circumstances that required capabilities he had developed during the darkest periods of his military service, skills that had been designed for operations where failure meant the death of innocent people and success required acting outside the constraints that govern normal law enforcement activities. "We need to evacuate the facility immediately," he told Evelis during an emergency briefing in her office as sunset painted the sky above Millbrook City in shades of orange and red that reminded him of fires he had tried to forget. "The sabotage is designed to create failures that will kill people, and we have less than 4 hours before the evening shift begins." But evacuation would accomplish exactly what the saboteurs intended: plant closure, economic devastation, and the appearance of corporate irresponsibility that would justify regulatory intervention and forced sale to competitors who had orchestrated the entire operation. 8,000 jobs and the economic stability of an entire region would be sacrificed to protect against casualties that might not occur if the sabotage could be identified and neutralized before shift change. "What are our alternatives?" Evelis asked, though her expression suggested she already understood that conventional options had been exhausted by the sophistication of the threat they were facing. "I go in alone," Daryl said quietly. "I identify and neutralize the sabotage before it can be activated. I do it without alerting the saboteurs that we've discovered their plan, so they can't accelerate their timeline or switch to backup systems we haven't identified." It was the kind of operation he had sworn never to undertake again, the type of mission that required capabilities developed for situations where conventional law enforcement was insufficient and where success meant becoming someone he had hoped Emma would never need to see. But it was also the kind of situation that justified the existence of those capabilities, circumstances where the alternative to action was the death of innocent people and the destruction of communities built around honest work and legitimate purposes. The infiltration of Thornfield manufacturing began at 10:30 p.m., 3 hours before the shift change that would bring 2,000 employees into areas where compromised safety systems waited to create the kind of industrial disaster that would dominate headlines for months. Daryl approached the facility using skills he had developed for penetrating defended positions, occupied by enemies who shot to kill, but adapted for an environment where the greatest threat came from detection rather than direct engagement. The manufacturing complex covered over 2 million square feet of production floor, administrative offices, and support facilities that operated around the clock to meet delivery schedules that kept automotive assembly lines running across 3 time zones. Navigation required intimate knowledge of layouts and procedures that Daryl had acquired through 6 months of security assessments and emergency planning. But execution required capabilities that went far beyond normal corporate security responsibilities. The corporate security responsibilities. Saboteurs had positioned their devices with sophisticated understanding of both manufacturing processes and structural engineering, placing explosive charges in system compromises at points where failures would cascade through interconnected systems in ways that would appear accidental until forensic investigation could determine otherwise. but they had also demonstrated understanding of security protocols and surveillance systems that suggested inside knowledge of Titan's procedures and personnel. Daryl's approach to neutralizing the sabotage required techniques he had learned for disabling explosive devices and compromising enemy equipment under combat conditions, skills that translated imperfectly to industrial environments, but that remained effective when applied with appropriate modifications. Each device required individual assessment and customized response, work that demanded complete focus and absolute precision when performed under time pressure that allowed no margin for error. The work progressed with methodical efficiency through areas of the plant where automated systems continued their normal operations, oblivious of the threats that had been positioned to transform them into instruments of destruction. Daryl moved through shadows and maintenance areas with the practiced invisibility that had once allowed him to operate in hostile territory, but now applied to protecting rather than eliminating, to preserving rather than destroying. By 1:15 a.m., he had identified and neutralized 17 separate devices that had been positioned to create cascading failures throughout the facility's most critical systems. But the 18th device, hidden within the main electrical distribution system that controlled power for the entire complex, was protected by anti-tampering mechanisms that would trigger detonation if approached incorrectly. With 30 minutes remaining before shift change, Daryl found himself facing the kind of decision that had defined the worst moments of his military career, accepting personal risk that exceeded reasonable limits in order to protect people who would never know how close they had come to disaster. The disarmament procedure required techniques he had learned for neutralizing enemy explosives under circumstances where mistakes meant instant death, capabilities that had been tested in environments where hesitation was more dangerous than action. Work required 22 minutes of absolute concentration while positioned within a confined space where detection would mean certain death and error would mean catastrophic failure that would kill hundreds of people and devastate communities that had trusted Titan Industries with their economic future. When he finally emerged from the electrical vault with sweat-soaked clothing and hands that shook from sustained adrenaline, Daryl carried evidence that would allow law enforcement to identify and prosecute an international conspiracy that had threatened not just corporate assets, but human lives on a scale that approached terrorism. The shift change proceeded normally at 2 a.m., with 2,000 employees transitioning into their work areas, unaware that their safety had depended on the intervention of someone whose background had prepared him for exactly this kind of crisis. The manufacturing processes continued their normal operations, producing components that would find their way into vehicles driven by families across the continent, maintaining the economic stability of communities that had been targeted for destruction by adversaries who had calculated that American industrial capacity could be eliminated through methods that avoided direct military confrontation. By dawn, law enforcement agencies were conducting coordinated arrests based on evidence that revealed a conspiracy involving foreign intelligence services, corporate competitors, and domestic collaborators whose planning had extended across multiple industries and geographic regions. The threat to Titan Industries had been part of a larger campaign of economic warfare that had targeted American manufacturing capabilities with methods that exceeded traditional espionage and approached acts of war. But the most significant outcome of the night's work was the recognition that some threats to civilian populations required responses that went beyond normal law enforcement capabilities, that the protection of communities sometimes demanded the application of skills that had been developed for more extreme circumstances but that retained their effectiveness when applied to legitimate defensive purposes. Daryl's successful neutralization of the threat had validated Evelis's recognition that some capabilities were too valuable to waste on routine security responsibilities, that the protection of innocent people sometimes required engaging with dangers that civilian agencies were not equipped to address. But it had also confirmed his own understanding that the skills he had hoped never to use again remained necessary in a world where sophisticated adversaries were willing to target non-combatants in pursuit of strategic objectives. The operation at Thornfield Manufacturing represented the ultimate test not just of tactical capabilities, but of the principles that guided their application. Proof that the person who had emerged from shadow wars and foreign conflicts could adapt those experiences to the protection of communities that depended on the continued existence of the manufacturing base that employed their neighbors and sustained their local economies. But it also established a precedent that would transform corporate security from passive protection to active defense, recognition that some threats required responses that matched their sophistication, and that the preservation of American industrial capabilities might depend on people who understood how to fight wars that were never officially declared. The aftermath of the Thornfield manufacturing incident rippled through corporate boardrooms, federal agencies, and international intelligence communities with implications that extended far beyond the successful prevention of industrial sabotage. Within 72 hours of Darrell's neutralization of the terrorist devices, coordinated arrests were taking place across 3 continents as law enforcement agencies dismantled a network that had been operating for over 2 years with objectives that approached economic warfare against American industrial capacity. The evidence recovered from the manufacturing facility revealed a conspiracy that involved foreign intelligence services, multinational corporations, and domestic collaborators whose ultimate goal had been the systematic destruction of American manufacturing capabilities through methods that avoided direct military confrontation. Thornfield had been selected not just for its economic importance, but as a proof of concept for operations that would have expanded to other critical infrastructure targets if the initial attack had succeeded in creating the intended casualties and economic disruption. But the most significant transformation wasn't occurring in government briefing rooms or corporate strategy sessions. It was happening in the quiet spaces where personal relationships were being redefined by the recognition that some experiences create bonds that transcend normal professional or social boundaries, connections forged by circumstances that reveal character under pressure and capabilities that demand purposes worthy of their sophistication. Evelyn Carowin stood in her corner office overlooking downtown Millbrook City, but her attention wasn't focused on the urban landscape that had once represented the scope of her professional world. Instead, she was reviewing transformation, plans for Titan Industries that would fundamentally alter not just the company's approach to security, but its understanding of corporate responsibility in an environment where economic competition had evolved into something approaching warfare. The woman who had built her career on strategic planning and market analysis was discovering that some challenges required resources and perspectives that couldn't be found in business schools or corporate consulting firms. The threats that had materialized around her kidnapping and the Thornfield sabotage had revealed adversaries with capabilities that exceeded traditional commercial competition, enemies whose objectives included not just market share, but the destruction of American industrial capacity through methods that targeted innocent civilians. Her response to this recognition represented more than policy adjustment or budget reallocation. It was acknowledgement that leadership in the modern environment required understanding capabilities and accepting responsibilities that went beyond normal corporate governance, recognition that the protection of employees and communities sometimes demanded engagement with realities that existed outside comfortable assumptions about civilized business practices. The security division that was emerging under Darrell's leadership represented something unprecedented in corporate America, a private capability that could identify and counter threats that exceeded the resources of traditional law enforcement, while operating within legal frameworks that honored constitutional principles and civilian oversight. It was neither military unit nor detective agency, but something new, a hybrid capability designed to protect civilian populations from adversaries who had learned to exploit the gaps between law enforcement and military authority, but the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how naturally Daryl had adapted his specialized background to purposes that aligned with his fundamental values. The capabilities that had once been applied to offensive operations in foreign conflicts were being redirected to the protection of communities and industries that formed the foundation of economic stability for millions of American families. His approach to building the security division reflected lessons learned during years of operational experience, but applied with wisdom that came from understanding the difference between necessary force and excessive force, between legitimate protection and abuse of power. The personnel he recruited were veterans who shared his understanding that some capabilities carried moral obligations, people who had demonstrated not just technical competence but ethical reliability under circumstances that tested character as much as skill. The most challenging aspect of his transformation from gas station attendant to director of corporate security had been managing the impact on Emma's life while maintaining the stability and normalcy that had been his primary objectives since leaving military service. The increased income and benefits associated with his new position provided opportunities for Emma's education and development that would have been impossible on a gas station salary, but they also brought visibility and responsibilities that could affect the careful anonymity he had constructed around their family life. The solution had emerged through conversations with Emma that revealed her inheritance of both his analytical intelligence and her late mother's emotional wisdom. At 8 years old, she possessed sophisticated understanding of the difference between necessary secrets and harmful deception, recognition that some aspects of adult responsibilities couldn't be shared with others but didn't represent dishonesty or shame. "Daddy helps people stay safe" had become her explanation when classmates asked about his work, a description that was accurate without being complete and that satisfied curiosity without revealing details that could compromise operational security. Her pride in his achievements was evident in the way she talked about current events during their evening conversations, connecting news stories about international tensions and economic challenges to her understanding that her father's work involved protecting people from problems they didn't always recognize. But Emma's most significant growth had come through her recognition that their family's experiences with difficulty and uncertainty had prepared them for challenges that other families might find overwhelming. The resilience she had developed during years when financial security was uncertain had evolved into confidence that they could adapt to whatever circumstances might arise, trust in her father's judgment that was based on demonstrated competence rather than blind faith. The relationship between Daryl and Evelyn had evolved through shared understanding of responsibilities that couldn't be delegated or explained to people who hadn't faced similar challenges. Their professional partnership was built on mutual respect for capabilities and judgment that had been tested under circumstances where mistakes carried consequences that extended far beyond personal failure, where success required integration of technical competence with ethical reliability. But more importantly, they had discovered compatibility that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. Evelyn's strategic brilliance and corporate leadership experience complemented Daryl's tactical expertise and operational judgment in ways that created synergy rather than competition, partnership that amplified both their individual capabilities and their collective effectiveness. Their personal relationship had developed with the careful deliberation that marked people who understood the difference between attraction and compatibility, between romantic interest and genuine partnership. Both had experienced losses that taught them to value authenticity over convenience, to prioritize substance over appearance, to recognize that lasting relationships required foundation in shared values rather than circumstantial compatibility. The evening when Daryl first brought Emma to meet Evelyn had been approached with careful preparation by all parties involved. Emma's natural curiosity about the woman who had become increasingly important in her father's life had been balanced by her protective instincts regarding their family dynamics, while Evelyn's genuine interest in Emma's well-being had been complicated by her lack of experience with parental responsibilities. But the interaction had proceeded with naturalness that surprised all of them. Emma's questions about Evelis's work had been answered with respect for her intelligence and genuine interest in her perspectives, while Evelis's questions about Emma's school and activities had been guided by authentic curiosity rather than obligatory politeness. The foundation for relationship had been established through recognition that they shared commitment to Daryl's happiness and Emma's welfare, common ground that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. The months that followed had seen gradual integration of their lives in ways that honored existing relationships while creating space for new connections. Evelis's involvement in Emma's activities had been guided by sensitivity to boundaries and respect for established routines, while Emma's acceptance of Evelis's presence had been facilitated by recognition that her father's happiness was enhanced rather than threatened by this new relationship. Transformation of Titan Industries under their joint leadership had become a model for corporate responsibility in an environment where traditional business practices were insufficient to address modern challenges. The security capabilities they had developed were being studied by government agencies and other corporations as examples of how private enterprise could contribute to national security without compromising civilian oversight or constitutional principles. But the most significant recognition of their work had come from unexpected sources. The communities surrounding Titan's manufacturing facilities had expressed gratitude not just for the preservation of employment, but for the recognition that their safety and economic stability deserved protection from threats that extended beyond normal business risks. The employees whose lives had been saved by the intervention at Thornfield had presented Daryl with a plaque expressing appreciation for service that went beyond normal corporate security responsibilities. Federal agencies responsible for counterterrorism and economic security had privately acknowledged that the intelligence gathered during the Thornfield operation had prevented attacks on other critical infrastructure targets, that the disruption of the conspiracy had protected communities across multiple states from sabotage that would have created both casualties and economic devastation. Most importantly, the transformation had validated principles that both Daryl and Evelis had carried throughout their careers, that capabilities carried obligations, that leadership required acceptance of responsibilities that extended beyond personal advancement, that the protection of innocent people justified engagement with dangers that others might prefer to ignore or delegate to someone else. The stability that emerged from their partnership represented more than successful crisis management or effective corporate governance. It was proof that people with different backgrounds and experiences could create synergy that transcended their individual limitations, that relationships built on mutual respect and shared values could withstand pressures that destroyed partnerships based on convenience or circumstantial attraction. As autumn turned to winter in Millbrook City, the new equilibrium that had emerged from crisis and transformation was being tested by the normal challenges that affected all families and organizations: budget pressures and scheduling conflicts, Emma's school projects and Evelis's board meetings, the endless details of daily life that required attention, regardless of how dramatically circumstances had changed. But the foundation that had been established through shared crisis and mutual recognition was proving strong enough to support the weight of ordinary life as well as extraordinary challenges. The partnership between Daryl and Evelis was evolving from emergency collaboration to permanent alliance, while Emma was discovering that her family's expansion had brought not disruption, but enhancement, additional resources and relationships that strengthened rather than complicated their existing bonds. Transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. The capabilities they had developed and the relationships they had forged were creating possibilities for service and achievement that extended beyond their immediate circumstances, potential for contributions to community and country, that honored both the sacrifices they had made and the responsibilities they had accepted. 2. Years after the Thornfield manufacturing incident, the transformation that had begun with a midnight encounter at North Point Fuel Station had evolved into something far more significant than corporate security innovation or personal redemption. The ripple effects of Daryl Fenmark's emergence from anonymity and Evelise Carowin's recognition of capabilities that transcended traditional business practices had created a model for corporate responsibility that was being studied and replicated across industries that face similar challenges from sophisticated adversaries. The Titan Industries corporate security division had become the template for a new approach to protecting critical infrastructure, one that bridged the gap between civilian law enforcement and military capabilities while maintaining constitutional oversight and ethical accountability. Federal agencies responsible for homeland security were quietly consulting with Daryl's team on threat assessment methodologies, while international allies were requesting assistance in developing similar capabilities to protect their own economic assets from state-sponsored sabotage and industrial terrorism. But the most significant legacy of their partnership wasn't found in government reports or corporate case studies. It was visible in the communities surrounding Titan's manufacturing facilities, where employees went to work each day with confidence that their safety was protected by people who understood the difference between theoretical security and practical protection, between bureaucratic procedures and effective response to genuine threats. The economic stability that had been preserved at Thornfield had allowed 3 generations of families to continue building their lives around honest work and legitimate opportunities, children to attend schools that were funded by property taxes from thriving industrial operations, local businesses to serve customers whose paychecks depended on manufacturing jobs that might have been eliminated if the sabotage had succeeded in its objectives. Emma Fenmark, now 10 years old, had grown into her understanding of her father's work with the wisdom that came from experiencing both struggle and stability, from witnessing transformation that honored sacrifice while creating opportunity for service. Her school projects increasingly reflected interest in international relations and economic development, subjects that connected her personal experience with broader questions about how communities protected themselves from threats that extended beyond local crime or natural disasters. Her relationship with Evelise had evolved into genuine affection that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. Evelise's involvement in Emma's education had been guided by respect for Daryl's parental authority while providing resources and perspectives that enriched Emma's understanding of possibilities that extended beyond their immediate community. Weekend trips to museums and cultural events had become family traditions that exposed Emma to experiences her father's gas station salary could never have provided. But more importantly, Emma was learning lessons about character and capability that couldn't be found in textbooks or classroom discussions. She was discovering that ordinary people often possessed extraordinary potential, that circumstances sometimes demanded responses that revealed capabilities that had been dormant but not absent, that the protection of communities required people willing to accept responsibilities that extended beyond personal advancement or comfortable routine. The house they now shared in Hillcrest Gardens represented more than improved financial circumstances or expanded family structure. It was proof that transformation was possible without abandoning principles, that success could be achieved through service rather than exploitation, that relationships built on mutual respect and shared values could withstand pressures that destroyed partnerships based on convenience or superficial attraction. Daryl's study contained both automotive certification materials and advanced security training resources, evidence of someone who continued learning and growing while maintaining connection to practical skills and honest work. His military decorations were displayed alongside Emma's school awards and family photographs that documented their journey from struggle to stability, from isolation to community, From survival to service, the recognition he received from government agencies and corporate leaders was significant. But the letters from Thornfield employees expressing gratitude for their continued employment and the safety of their families represented validation that transcended professional achievement. These were people who understood that their ability to provide for their children and contribute to their communities had depended on someone willing to risk everything to prevent disasters they would never know had been planned. Evelus's transformation had been equally profound but perhaps more visible to public observers. The CEO, who had once measured success primarily through quarterly profits and market share, was now recognized as a leader in corporate responsibility and national security. Someone who understood that business leadership in the modern environment required engagement with challenges that extended beyond traditional commercial competition. Her testimony before congressional committees investigating economic espionage and industrial terrorism had established her as an authoritative voice on threats that most corporate executives preferred to ignore or delegate to others. But her most significant contribution was demonstrating that private enterprise could contribute to national security without compromising civilian oversight or democratic principles, that corporate resources could be applied to community protection without creating private armies or unaccountable enforcement mechanisms. The marriage ceremony that took place in the garden behind their hillcrest home was deliberately modest, attended by family and close friends who understood that the commitment being formalized had been tested by circumstances that revealed character under pressure and compatibility that transcended convenient attraction. Emma served as maid of honor, her pride evident as she watched her father and Evelus exchange vows that reflected lessons learned through shared crisis and mutual recognition of capabilities that deserved purposes worthy of their sophistication. The honeymoon was spent visiting Titan manufacturing facilities across 3 states, not from obligation but from genuine interest in the communities whose economic stability depended on decisions made in corporate boardrooms and security assessments conducted by people who understood the difference between theoretical threats and actual dangers. It was a busman's holiday that reflected their shared recognition that some responsibilities couldn't be separated from personal life, that leadership meant being present when presence mattered most. But the most lasting impact of their story was found in the example they provided to others who possessed capabilities that exceeded their current circumstances, people who had learned to blend into ordinary life while carrying extraordinary potential. Veterans transitioning to civilian employment, immigrants whose credentials weren't recognized in their new communities, single parents whose responsibilities had forced them to accept positions that didn't challenge their full capabilities, all could find inspiration in the recognition that circumstances sometimes create opportunities to serve purposes worthy of hidden strengths. The corporate security model they had developed was being adapted by companies across multiple industries, creating employment opportunities for veterans whose backgrounds had prepared them for exactly the kinds of challenges that traditional security firms were ill-equipped to address. The recognition that some threats required responses that matched their sophistication was leading to institutional changes that honored both public safety and constitutional principles. Most importantly, their story demonstrated that transformation was possible at any age and under any circumstances, that people who had learned to survive could also learn to thrive, that capabilities developed under extreme conditions could be redirected to purposes that protected rather than destroyed, that preserved rather than eliminated. As Emma entered middle school with confidence that came from understanding her father's strength and Evelus's wisdom, as Daryl continued developing security capabilities that served legitimate purposes worthy of his background, as Evelus applied corporate resources to challenges that extended beyond profit margins and market positioning, their legacy was being written in the lives of people who would never know how their safety and prosperity had been protected by someone who had emerged from shadows to serve purposes that justified the sacrifices required to reach that point. The gas station where it all began still operated under new management, serving customers who had no idea that the parking lot had once been the scene of professional kidnapping prevented by capabilities that existed far outside normal civilian experience. But the example established that night continued to ripple through communities where ordinary people carried extraordinary potential, where circumstances sometimes demanded responses that revealed character under pressure and strength that had been dormant but never absent. Their story wasn't ending but expanding, creating possibilities for service and achievement that would inspire others to recognize their own capabilities and accept responsibilities that extended beyond personal advancement to community protection, national security, and the preservation of values that made such sacrifice worthwhile. In a world where sophisticated threats required sophisticated responses, where the protection of innocent people sometimes demanded engagement with dangers that civilian agencies were ill-equipped to address, their partnership had proved that some capabilities were too valuable to waste on circumstances that didn't challenge their full potential. That transformation was possible for anyone willing to accept purposes worthy of their deepest strengths. Legacy they were building would outlast their individual service, inspiring others to emerge from anonymity when circumstances demanded it, to recognize that ordinary people often possessed extraordinary capabilities, and to accept that the protection of communities sometimes required people willing to risk everything for purposes that transcended personal safety or comfortable routine. That was the most disturbing truth of their entire story, not the violence or the capabilities or the sophisticated nature of modern threats, but the recognition that such protection had always depended on people willing to emerge from ordinary life when extraordinary circumstances demanded it, and that such people were walking among us every day, unrecognized and unremarked, until the moment when their hidden strengths became the difference between tragedy and triumph. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.